This meeting is being recorded.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, the Plumed Serpent, Lawrence and Primitive Communism. Over 300 critical works concerning the Plumed Serpent have been published to date. An analysis of these studies reveals that they fall into four broad categories: biographical, ideological, psychological, and feminist, and the novel as a work of art. Previous studies on the ideology of the Plumed Serpent have tended to focus on themes such as leadership and fascism. I would like to suggest something very different, that the Plumed Serpent is an allegory for a return to primitive communism. In the same way that George Orwell's Animal Farm uses farm animals to characterize the Russian Revolution and communism, in the Plumed Serpent, Lawrence uses ancient Aztec gods to represent the Mexican Revolution and primitive communism. Lawrence was deeply impacted by his experience of living in New Mexico and Mexico. He saw in the indigenous culture a potential alternative way of living to what he called mechanical capitalism. Karl Marx was also interested in pre-capitalist formations, and after reading Morgan's book on ancient society, amended his views on historical materialism. Lawrence and Marx were critical of the economic base of industrial capitalism, which shapes and determines the political and ideological superstructure. Lawrence rejected bourgeois democracy in favor of a natural aristocracy, such as could be found among indigenous societies before they were decimated and corrupted by colonialism and imperialism. Lawrence advocated an aristocracy of wisdom, talent, and ability rather than an aristocracy of birth or money. His aristocrats represent the finest qualities of society. They embody the best interests of the people they govern. Marx made a similar point about the leaders of a communist society who would, I quote, have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Raymond and Cipriano, the leaders of the Quetzalcoatl movement, are the new aristocrats and propagandists for a new primitive ideology, composing and arranging for the printing of incantatory hymns around which the rituals of their campaign are organized and its core beliefs expressed. These hymns are a call to action to the Mexican indigenous peoples, in the same way that Marx and Engels produced the Communist Manifesto to rouse, educate, and guide the European industrial proletariat. The key message of the hymns and the manifesto is the same. I quote, "They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions." The key tension in the novel is a post-colonial clash, both within and between civilizations. Kate, the protagonist, finds among the Mexican people of many tribes and languages something that is unbroken, eternally resistant. Their reversion to the originary myths of Indian primitivism both challenges the oppressive European colonization of their Mexican heritage and utilizes it to create a revolutionary movement to liberate and return to its authentic roots. In Quetzalcoatl, and more particularly in The Plumed Serpent, Lawrence articulates an alternative to conventional dominant worldviews and the politics of social and cultural change. So my talk is in six parts. Historical materialism and the development of Mexico, primitive communism, the Quetzalcoatl movement, natural aristocracy, true democracy, and a short conclusion. In terms of historical materialism and the development of Mexico, it is important to locate the setting of Quetzalcoatl and the Plumed Serpent within Mexican history and society. The Quetzalcoatl plot was shaped and determined by Mexico, the place, with its enormous depth of history and cultural memory. History is not only cyclical, as Christ displaced Quetzalcoatl at the time of the conquest, so now Quetzalcoatl displaces Christ, Roberts said in 1996. The novel is set in a revolutionary age, and this is what makes the Quetzalcoatl movement possible. It is a response to the changing and turbulent concrete material conditions in Mexico at that time. The Quetzalcoatl plot has something of the quality of a utopia It looks to the future while drawing on valued aspects of the past. It rejects capitalism and socialism and yearns for a return to primitive communism. In his essay, Indians and Englishmen, in the evolutionary mode of the time, Lawrence associates the Apache elder with the primordial ages, declining to relive a tribal experience, but acknowledging a deep sense of kinship with the old father. This is his complex but characteristic stand on the necessity of progressing while still cherishing continuity with ancient cultures. I quote, "We do not need to live the past over again. Our darkest tissues are twisted in this old tribal experience. Our warmest blood came out of the old tribal fire, and they vibrate still in our blood. But I don't want to go back to them. I never want to deny them or break with them. But there is no going back. Always onward, still further." Lawrence is repeating a common model of evolution, tracing human development from a tribal or primitive stage to a cultured modern achievement. H.G. Wells claimed that humans have progressed from a tribal stage through a Neolithic period to arrive at the age of cultivation, the age of the white man in Europe. Wells also claimed that America lagged 6,000 years behind the old world. In his essay on human destiny, Lawrence describes progress. I quote, "Man, poor, conscious, forever animal man, has a very stern destiny from which he is never allowed to escape. It is his destiny that he must move on and on in the thought adventure." Lawrence rejects the regressive lure of the past, as in his comment to Maurice Magnus about the Middle Ages. One can't go back. He makes a similar point in Pan in America. And we cannot return to the primitive life, to live in teepees and hunt with bows and arrows. Yet live we must, and once life has been conquered, it is pretty difficult to live. The Pan relationship, which the world of man once had with all the world, was better than anything man has now. Lawrence suggests the business of living is to travel away from the source, but you must start every single day fresh from the source. According to the Marxist theory of historical and dialectical materialism, 5 main types of relations of production are known to history: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. Each stage is determined by its economic base, which in turn shapes its ideological superstructure. Marx initially argued that every society would inevitably have to pass through each of these stages, as this was a scientific law of economic, social, and political development. The theory was that each stage was born out of the previous level of development. So, for example, feudalism contained the seeds of capitalism. When the new social system was born, it would retain only those elements of feudalism that were useful to the development of capitalism. It would also develop new characteristics that would enable capitalism to flourish and grow, until eventually the conditions were right for the birth of socialism. Historical materialism can be applied to the development of Mexico. The primitive communist stage existed before the Spanish conquest. During the classic period, which was 200 BC to 900 AD, Quetzalcoatl, the nature god of Indian tribes in Mexico and the main deity of the ruling city of Teotihuacan, was represented by the Quetzal, a rattlesnake covered in green feathers. He could also assume human form wearing a bird mask. Quetzalcoatl was worshipped as the god of civilization, learning, and knowledge, and was associated with Venus, the morning star. The same name was used as a title for the chief priests. There were persistent myths referring to the conflict between an old and a new worship, symbolized by a struggle between Quetzalcoatl and the war and sky gods of the later Aztec religion. The elevation of a god to the role of tribal protector led to the domination of his worshippers in the community, and was as important to the ancient Mexicans as the domination of an economic or political system is to our own modern populations. In April 1923, Lawrence visited the pre-Aztec pyramids at Teotihuacan, and soon afterwards he wrote Au revoir, USA. Lawrence notes the superficiality of modern democracy and white civilization in the New World, which has a rattlesnake coiled at its heart, The great pale face overlay hasn't gone into the soil half an inch. These old civilizations down here, they never got any higher than Quetzalcoatl. The great pyramids of a vanished pre-Aztec people and the temple of Quetzalcoatl. The old beliefs are still there. The Spanish white superimposition with Rococo church towers seems so rickety and temporary. The pyramids seem so indigenous, rising like hills out of the earth itself. The one goes down with a clatter, the other remains. Slavery emerged from the primitive communist stage of development. Mexican society existed for the benefit of the group, and each member was supposed to do his part in preserving the community. Those who did not do so lost their civil rights and became slaves. They might do this voluntarily, or because they were prisoners of war, or were punished for crimes, or were sold by their parents. Their treatment differed according to the circumstances of their enslavement. Military captives were bought for domestic service or put to work on some communal enterprise. Criminal slaves lost their free status for such offences as failure to denounce treachery. Penal slaves were privately owned, usually to make restitution to those whom they had injured. Voluntary slavery was assumed by the poor and the landless who needed food, by the indolent who were too lazy to provide for their own support, by gamblers and by prostitutes who wanted finery. Parents often sold a child to be replaced by a younger one when the first was old enough materially to contribute to the family welfare. Slavery, except in the case of war prisoners, was not too exacting. A slave could control his family, have slaves of his own, and his children were born free. What the slave lost was his eligibility for civic office. After the conquest, Mexico entered the feudal stage of development. Spanish overlords and the Catholic Church took over Indian land, much of which had been held in communal ownership by tribal custom, the ejido system. This was replaced by the hacienda system, large estates in the Mexican countryside that had a feudal relationship between the Spanish masters and the Mexican workers, who became campesinos or peones. Campesinos were peasant farmers. The term peons or peones meant farmhands, effectively serfs belonging to the owner of a hacienda, but it subsequently came to denote labourers of all kinds. In a struggle that lasted from 1810 to 1821, the Mexican people won their independence from Spain, but achieved little political or economic freedom. The Catholic Church retained its wealth and privileges, and opposing factions of the new Mexican ruling class kept the country in a state of constant revolution. The first advances to bourgeois democracy came when Benito Juarez began the reform movement to break up the vast holdings of the church for redistribution among the rural poor, mostly Indians. Juarez became president in 1861, but was driven out by the French, who in 1864 made Maximilian the Emperor of Mexico. When the USA compelled France to withdraw her troops in 1867, Maximilian was defeated and executed. Juarez was re-elected in 1871, but most of the land that had been taken from the church was absorbed by the big haciendas. Mexico entered its capitalist period of development under the presidency of Porfirio Diaz, who governed by lavish favors to supporters, unlimited privilege to foreign capital, and brutal suppression of opposition. Mexico saw a great expansion of exports and some industrial growth, but this was a thin surface over poverty and misery among peasants and the growing population of industrial workers. The hacienda system thrived under Diaz. It was estimated that by the early 1900s, 840 hacendados owned between them 3/4 of Mexico's total land area. The bourgeois stage of the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, when Madero called for a national uprising, which brought together disaffected peasants, middle-class liberals, and workers. According to Lenin, each revolution goes through a number of stages. I quote, "While recognizing the incontestably bourgeois nature of the revolution, which is incapable of directly overstepping the bounds of a mere democratic revolution, our slogan pushes forward this particular revolution and strives to mold it into forms most advantageous to the proletariat. Consequently, it strives to make the very most of the democratic revolution in order to attain the greatest success in the further struggle of the proletariat for socialism." Diaz resigned in 1911, but Madero was unable to resolve the conflict between those who wanted to accelerate the revolution and those demanding order and stability. The next phase of the bourgeois revolution took place in 1917, when Carranza established a new constitution which formulated new principles for agrarian reform, recovery of natural resources from foreign hands, and improvements in labour conditions. The government was able to commandeer underutilized land to create small holdings or communal holdings. The hacienda system was abolished, but continued to exert great political and economic influence in rural districts. When Obregon was elected in 1920, his government was strongly left-wing and began to put into practice a number of the anti-clerical articles of the 1917 Constitution. Property belonging to the church was seized, Catholic schools closed down, and many priests were deprived of political and citizenship rights. Obregon's limited redistribution of land and encouragement of trade unions raised a cry of Bolshevism in some quarters. When Lawrence first visited Mexico in the spring of 1923, Obregon was halfway through his term in office, and the question of his successor was being discussed. Lawrence refers to little revolutions that were probably the dozens of local particularist uprisings, which were the manifestations of the National Revolution. For example, in December 1923, De la Huerta rebelled against the government in opposition to the official presidential candidate, Plutarco Calles, the interior minister, politician and general most able to galvanize working class and left-wing support. Although he won the support of a large part of the army, De la Huerta was eventually defeated and driven into exile. At least 7,000 people died, and the Obregon regime was seriously shaken. The country remained unsettled until Calles succeeded Obregon as president. Lawrence arrived in Mexico City shortly before Calles was inaugurated in December 1924. Once in office, Calles carried on policies begun by Obregon, but applied them with more vigor, stepping up the still lagging agrarian reforms. He also took extreme measures to suppress Catholicism and its influence. The immediate historical situation of Mexico presented Lawrence with a particular opportunity. For a brief period following the revolutionary decade, cultivated and influential individuals were seeking consciously to recover the pre-Columbian culture of the Indian peoples. The new president invited the great Mexican anthropologist Manuel Gamio, who Lawrence tried to meet in Mexico City, to become Minister of State and advise on the direction of Indian affairs in cultural and educational policy. Ramon, the leader of the Quetzalcoatl movement in the Plumed Serpent, is also a trained anthropologist seeking to reconcile the present with the native tradition. This tradition was a form of primitive communism. It is important to emphasize that the Marxist concept of primitivism, the fundamental features of social constitution in primitive times before the introduction of the state, relates to the historical stage of development of a given society rather than the cultural capacity of the individuals within that society. Any society that existed before the development of the state was deemed to be primitive. In other words, the fact that the first stage of development was called primitive communism and it had the word primitive in its title does not mean that Marxists regard indigenous peoples as primitives in the same way that European colonialists regarded Native Americans as savages, noble or otherwise. In the Marxist lexicon, the term primitive is a description of an economic and social system rather than a pejorative judgment of its people and their culture. Marx and Engels first described primitive communism in part one of the German ideology. A quote, "The first form of ownership is tribal ownership. It corresponds to the undeveloped stage of production at which a people lives by hunting and fishing, by the rearing of beasts, or in the highest stage, agriculture. The division of labour is at this stage still very elementary and is confined to a further extension of the natural division of labour imposed by the family. The social structure is therefore limited to an extension of the family, patriarchal family chieftains, below them the members of the tribe. Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, is the main Marxist source on primitive communism and is based on Morgan's Ancient Society, which focused on the Iroquois and especially the Seneca tribe. In Iroquois society, primitive communism, or the pre-state social system, was founded on the gens, which was a kinship or family organization that was determined by common descent and was bound together by social and religious institutions into a distinct community. The gens had a number of common features. The gens elects its sachem, or head of the gens, in peace, and its chief, leader in war, and the gens deposes the sachem and the war chief at will. Special religious ceremonies are more or less connected with the gens. The gens has a council, which is a democratic assembly of all male and female adult Gentiles, all with equal votes. Engels suggested that Iroquois society, based on the principles of primitive communism, was a wonderful constitution because it had, I quote, no soldiers, no gendarmes or police, no nobles, kings, regents, prefects or judges, no prisons, no lawsuits, and everything takes its orderly course. All quarrels and disputes are settled by the whole of the community affected. The household is maintained by a number of families in common and is communistic. The land belongs to the tribe. There is no need for even a trace of our complicated administrative apparatus with all its ramifications. The decisions are taken by those concerned, and in most cases, everything has been already settled by the custom of centuries. There cannot be any poor or needy. The communal household and the gens know their responsibilities towards the old, the sick, and those disabled in war. All are equal and free, the women included. There is no place yet for slaves, nor as a rule for the subjugation of other tribes. And what men and women such a society breeds is proved by the admiration inspired in all white people who have come into contact with unspoiled Indians, and by their personal dignity, uprightness, strength of character, and courage. Morgan's Ancient Society was an active factor in the qualitative leap in Marx's thought on revolution in underdeveloped countries. The Iroquois and every other surviving tribal society were engaged in a continuous struggle against the system of private property and the state. As such, they were revolutionary forces, just like the industrial workers in the West who were embroiled in the class struggle. It was only after reading Morgan that anthropology, previously peripheral to Marx's thought, became its vital center. His entire conception of historical development, and particularly of pre-capitalist societies, now gained immeasurably in depth and precision. Above all, his introduction to the Iroquois and other tribal societies sharpened his sense of the living presence of indigenous peoples in the world and of their possible role in future revolutions. Marx took very extensive interpolated extracts from Morgan's Ancient Society, as indicated in his vertical lines on the pages of his notebooks, emphasizing particular passages which focus first and foremost on the communal, consanguine, kinship-based community, including its basis in the gens or clan, its democratic form and relative equality of women, and two, the associated communal property forms constituting the natural economy with its non-commodity trade. Marx also paid attention to the crops cultivated and forms of agriculture. All members of the Iroquois gens, he wrote, drawing on Morgan, were personally free, bound to defend each other's freedom. His studies were constantly focused on the reconstitution of ancient forms of indigenous and non-capitalist societies on a higher historical level, helped along by the persistence of earlier cultures and cultural forms. Indeed, Marx was entranced by Morgan's contention that the ancient gens, as exemplified by the Iroquois, contain the communal nucleus to be reproduced on a higher plane of the associative society of the future. In Morgan's words, as taken down and emphasized by Marx, it, in other words, a higher plane of society, will be a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gentes or communal kinship society. Marx increasingly stressed the viability of the primitive commune, its powers of resistance to historical integration, and its capacity to develop into a higher form of economy without prior destruction. Pre-class society forms a large and complex historical epoch of its own, with its own history and laws of development, and its own varieties of socio-economic organization. Primitive communism appealed to Marx because it represented a whole way of life that was sharply counterposed to modern industrial civilization. Primitive communism gave Marx insights into the concrete possibilities of a free society as it had actually existed in history. It demonstrated conclusively the true complexity of primitive societies, as well as their grandeur, their essential superiority in real human terms to the degraded civilization found on the fetishism of commodities. Marx's overall admiration for North American Indian societies generally, and for the Iroquois in particular, is made clear in his highlighting of their characteristic sense of independence and personal dignity, qualities that he appreciated but found greatly diminished as humankind's property career advanced. Primitive communities had incomparably greater vitality than the Semitic, Greek, Roman, and modern capitalist societies. Iroquois society stood much higher than any of the societies poisoned by the pestilential breath of civilization. So this now relates to, this kind of sets the scene, if you like, for the Quetzalcoatl movement. In Quetzalcoatl, Raymond sees the uselessness of politics. The great democracy of the North depressed him and made him feel hopeless. He takes no part in the revolutions and anti-revolutions that are shaking Mexico. The future of the Mexican people, for him, is neither the ghastly theorism of communism or the vile mechanism of industrialism. The Indian people are no more than a bone between two dogs, he says. They need a hero who can deliver them from the industrialism, commerce, mechanization, and fathomless greed that will destroy them. Ramon is going to bring back our own gods. We need Quetzalcoatl. To find the future in the past, we must gather up the past before we can have any future, he says. The Quetzalcoatl movement symbolizes a return to primitive communism. Your old gods are ready to return to you, he says. The gods must be born again. We must be born again. The changes that Lawrence makes between Quetzalcoatl and the Plumed realization of the vision of a new, non-Europeanized, post-colonial and post-Christian social and cultural order. Kate represents the dominating European culture, which has colonized and perverted the historically indigenous traditional culture of Mexico. She has a strange feeling in Mexico, I quote, of the old prehistoric humanity, the old mode of consciousness, that which is aboriginal in America still belongs to, before the mental spiritual world came into being. Cipriano and Ramon symbolize the latent Indian uprising. They say there is no Mexican society. There are only Mexican parasites. Now the Indians in America are lying low. They are sending up no shoots of life, not yet, but their roots are very deep. And when they start to grow upwards, it will be like an earthquake to the white man's world of factories and machines. They plan to finish the Mexican Revolution, or rather, they intend to follow the bourgeois revolution from above with a proletarian revolution from below. The Mexican Indians are, I quote, like trees, forests that the white man felled in their coming, but the roots of the trees are deep and alive and forever sending up new shoots. And each new shoot that comes up overthrows a Spanish church or an American factory. And soon the dark forest will rise again and shake the Spanish buildings from the face of the earth. The Quetzalcoatl movement represents a return to primitive communism before the white man came to Mexico. It is a call to arms that is signaled by the beating of a drum, which arouses that timeless primeval passion of the prehistoric races with their intense and complicated religious significance spreading on the air. The material basis of Iroquois society created an ideology that encompassed liberty, equality, fraternity, freedom, independence, and dignity. This ideology was also expressed through what Engels called special religious ceremonies and the religious rites of the Indians. For example, at the 6 yearly religious festivals of the Iroquois, the sachems and war chiefs were included ex officio among the keepers of the faith and had priestly functions. This suggests that the faith or ideology of the Iroquois was codified within their ceremonies and religious rites and maintained and practiced by their elders or the priests. In the Plumed Serpent, the hymns of Quetzalcoatl, the ideology of the movement, were spreading rapidly from one end of the Republic to the other. Kate sees a young man take a sheet of paper, like an advertisement leaflet, from under his blanket. At the top, it had the Quetzalcoatl symbol called the eye, the ring with the bird shape standing in the middle. This was the symbol of the movement. I am Quetzalcoatl with a dark face, who lived in Mexico in other days. The hymns of the Quetzalcoatl movement are a call to action. I quote, "It was like a darkly glowing, vivid nucleus of new life, like the center of the everlasting fire. Surely this was a new kindling of mankind. The Communist Manifesto served a similar purpose. It is high time," Marx said, "that communists should openly, in the face of the world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies with a manifesto." The hymns were a way of letting the people know that Quetzalcoatl was coming back to freedom from their oppressors. I am on the threshold. I am stepping across the border. I am Quetzalcoatl, lord of both ways, star between day and the dark. To paraphrase Marx and Engels, a spectre is haunting Mexico, the spectre of Quetzalcoatl. He saw the men that worked in the fields with foreign overseers, Lawrence says. The pioneers and landowners are engaged in a class struggle as defined by Marx and Engels. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle, they said. Oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted fight that each time ended in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large. In Mexico, the colonialist oppressors are extracting all the wealth. They want gold, Raymond says. They want silver from the mountains and oil, much oil. They take sugar, wheat and maize, coffee, even the juicy rubber. And they are industrializing the country, creating an urban proletariat. They put up tall chimneys that smoke, he says, and in the biggest houses they keep their machines. This is the same process of colonization that was described by Marx and Engels. The discovery of America, they said, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The colonization of America, trade with the colonies, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never known before. The railway system opened up Mexico to exploitation, and in the spirit of revolutionary subversion, Raymond uses this system to distribute the hymns of Quetzalcoatl all over the country. Each soldier took only 100 sheets, but in every town there was a recognized reader of the hymns. Raymond announces, I am Quetzalcoatl of the Morning Star. I am the living Quetzalcoatl, and you are men who should be men of the Morning Star. Marx and Engels describe communists as those who represent the interests of the movement as a whole. They are the most advanced and resolute section of the proletariat, that section which pushes forward all others. The people of the Morning Star, the most enlightened section of the Mexican working class, sing, welcome to Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl has come. It was as if a stone had been rolled off them all, and their voice can be heard for the first time, deep, wild, with a certain exultance and menace and defiance. A new world had begun. Raymond makes it clear that when men seek life first, they will not seek land nor gold. And if the old communal system comes back and the village and land are one, it will be very good. For truly, no man can possess lands. Marx and Engels stated that the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. All the members of an Iroquois gens were personally free, and they were bound to defend each other's freedom. They were equal in privileges and in personal rights, the sachem and chiefs claiming no superiority, and they were a brotherhood bound together by the ties of kin. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, though never formulated, were cardinal principles of the gens. These facts are material because the gens was the unit of a social and governmental system, the foundation upon which Indian society was organized. It serves to explain that sense of independence and personal dignity, universally an attribute of Indian character. Raymond is the living Quetzalcoatl of Mexico, who will unite the people of insight and imagination. They are the only ones who understand that any form of exploitation is just a negation of living. They will form a new aristocracy of the soul, not of birth or money, an esoteric, united aristocracy of the world, self-elected because of honest righteousness and electing others for the same. If the land was communally owned, then the working of the land and the control of labor should be in the charge of the best men in the community. Marx and Engels suggested that communists were the most advanced and resolute section of the working class of every country, that section which pushes all others forward. They also had the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. In Paris letter, Lawrence shuns palaces, declaring himself a true democrat in opposition to great hereditary houses or dynasties. He nonetheless argues with some of the stereotypical ideas of democracy. Far better, he thinks, was the natural aristocracy he attributes to American Indians, comparable to the nobility in Homer. Lawrence praises the American Indian aristocrat chosen by merit and not heredity. I don't believe anymore in democracy, he said, but I can't believe in the old sort of aristocracy either. What I believe in is the old Homeric aristocracy, when the grandeur was inside the man. These men were the chieftains and the aristocrats by instinct and by choice, and the Red Indians only knew the aristocrat by instinct. Lawrence knew the Pueblo Indian way of electing chief officers and voting in councils of elders, of being born into clan membership, but advancing through rites of passage. Collier, too, referred in the Pueblo's Last Stand to the Homeric laughter heard in the Pueblos. The leader was leader in his own being, not because he was somebody's son or had so much money. Aristocracy truly does not go by birth. Skeptical of Western bourgeois democracy as he saw it, Lawrence was a spokesman for the right, the sacred duty to practice natural aristocracy. In contrast to the old hereditary aristocracy, this society would depend on the citizens' new reverence for their heroes and new regard for their comrades, he said. Marx and Engels made a similar point. The leaders of a communist society would have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Lawrence rejects both the old aristocracy of birth is bunk, he said, and the new aristocracy, the aristocracy of money. Instead, he believes that in the natural aristocracy, which consists in not what a man can do, but what he is. He contrasts the vitality of the natural aristocrat with the democratic mass, which is like a vast, sluggish, ghastly, greedy porcupine lumbering with inertia. Democracy has nothing to fight for except money, money, money. It's time to recognize the new aristocracy, who in the coming era will rule the world, making the embers of financial internationalism and industrial internationalism pale upon the hearth of the earth, he said. It is important to note that Lawrence's natural aristocracy is not fascism. Cipriano is one of the most feared men in Mexico by the upper classes. The lower classes look upon him as their real representative. It is Cipriano himself who, in Quetzalcoatl, rejects such authoritarianism. Fascism won't hold against the lust for anarchy, which is at the bottom of the fascisti themselves, he says. The fascisti only live because they think they can bully society. Raymond and Cipriano do not seek political power. Instead, they attempt to circumvent the cultural decay which surrounds them and quell the ever-rising tide of violence in the country by channeling it into ritual, which they hope will legitimize the Quetzalcoatl movement and regenerate the culture of Mexico. Engels notes the democratic and egalitarian nature of Iroquois society. For example, the leadership positions, both civil and military, were elected by universal suffrage. All members of the gens had a vote, both men and women. These elected officials were ceremonially invested in office by the Common Council of the whole Iroquois Confederacy. So they had to pass through two democratic processes, one at the local electoral level and the other at the federal ceremonial level. The power of these leaders was circumscribed. I quote, the authority of the sachem within the gens was paternal and purely moral in character. He had no means of coercion. By virtue of his office, he was also a member of the tribal council of the Senecas and also of the federal council of all the Iroquois. The war chief could only give orders on military expeditions. The federal council was a democratic assembly of all male and female adult Gentiles, all with equal voice. The council elected sachems, war chiefs, and deposed them. In short, it was the sovereign power in the gens. In his essay, Certain Americans and an Englishman, Lawrence refers to the old autonomous tribal body of the Pueblo. When the Spanish first contacted the Rio Grande Pueblos in 1540, they found representative councils of elders already in place. These bodies governed along with priests, caciques, or spiritual leaders. Collier called the Pueblos the oldest self-governing democratic institutions in the Western Hemisphere and presented the Pueblo method as a model of tribal self-government for other tribes. This was the type of democracy that Lawrence believed in. He rejected bourgeois democracy, which was a dead ideal, along with the state and the nation. Governments, he said, were just board meetings of big businessmen. Marx and Engels make a similar point. That the executive of the modern state, they say, is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Cipriano's idea in Quetzalcoatl is to make all the land for some distance belong to the commune, and we shall establish a system something like the old village system, he says, with a war chief and a cacique and a peace chief, but also a chieftainess and a woman cacique. Then the women will weave again in their houses, spin for themselves, and the women of peace will be chieftainess of them all. And the peace chief of the men will divide the land and be chief judge and the live in Quetzalcoatl. The term cacique or war chief was applied by the Spaniards to any tribal or political leader among the indigenous peoples they encountered. In the Plumed Serpent, Ezekiel was just a hired labor, yet working on the land, he never felt he was working for a master. It was the land he worked for. Somewhere inside himself, he felt that the land was his and he belonged in a measure to it. Perhaps a lingering feeling of tribal communal land ownership and service, Lawrence observed. In pre-conquest days, a clan or a village possessed a portion of land, an ejido, whose use could be passed from father to son, but which could never be owned by an individual. The ejido system was re-established by the 1917 Constitution, whereby land could be expropriated by the government and designated for communal use, much as it had been under the Aztecs. When the government gave the peasants strips of land, dividing up the big haciendas, Ezekiel was allotted a little piece outside the village. But he had no blood connection with this square allotment of a natural earth, Lawrence said, and he could not get himself into relations with it. The Calais administration was just beginning to set up more extensive redistribution of land from some of the big haciendas at the time when Lawrence was writing The Plumed Serpent. Marx and Engels called for the abolition of property in land. Lawrence suggested that property is only there to be used, not to be possessed. The question of property will never be settled till people cease to care for property. When people are no longer obsessed with the desire to possess property, only then shall we be glad to turn it over to the state. The property question will be settled when man experiences a new spontaneous impulse to free himself from the extraneous load of possession and walk naked and light. We must, he said, deposit all property on the ground and learn to walk without it. We must stand aside. And when men stand aside, they stand in a new world of man has come to pass. This is the democracy, the new order. True democracy requires the abolition of private property. In his review of Bottom Dogs by Edward Dahlberg, Lawrence said, The deep psychic change, which we call the breaking of the heart, the collapse of the flow of spontaneous warmth between a man and his fellow, happens, of course, now all over the world. It brings the people into a much more complete social unison for good or evil, but it throws them apart in their private individual emotions. Before, they were like cells in a complex tissue, alive and functioning diversely in a vast organism composed of family, clan, village, nation. Now they are like grains of sand, friable, heaped together in a vast inorganic democracy. This is a perfect description of social relations under primitive communism. Cells in a complex tissue, alive and functioning diversely in a vast organism composed of family, clan, village, nation, which created an organic or true democracy. Marx did not mechanically apply historical materialism to all societies. He moved away from a Eurocentric and developmentalist lens and reached into history and culture of indigenous societies, identifying with their resistance and seeing in their past and present the possibility of a broader world future. He came to understand that primitive communism could be a revolutionary force that had the potential to challenge and overthrow the forces of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. Lawrence also saw the potential of primitive communism to transform society. His main theme in Quetzalcoatl and the Plumed Serpent is the revival of the primordial spirit of the continent to be achieved by cultural and political revolution. The contemporary state of Mexican society was such that a radical upheaval of any sort was imaginable. The political turmoil of the Mexican Revolution, going on since 1910, had in great part originated among the oppressed Indian majority. But for Lawrence, the struggle was misdirected. The true revolution must be not economic and political, but cultural and ideological. If a truly indigenous consciousness could be awakened by calling back the Mexican gods in a form appealing to contemporary Indians, then all other essential reshaping of society would follow. Thank you.